When that sound cut through the studio, nobody, not the audience, not the cameras, not even Jimmy Fallon himself, could have predicted what Taylor Swift would do next. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday night at The Tonight Show. Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza was packed with 240 people who had waited months for tickets. The Roots were in their corner, instruments ready. Jimmy Fallon sat behind his desk, tie loosened after the monologue, his signature boyish grin lighting up the room as he prepared to welcome one of the biggest stars on the planet. Taylor Swift walked onto that stage in a stunning emerald dress, the audience erupting into screams that seemed to shake the very walls of the historic studio. Jimmy stood, applauding, his enthusiasm genuine as always. This was the part of the job he loved most, connecting with people, making them feel seen, creating moments that viewers at home would remember long after the credits rolled. "Taylor Swift, everybody!" Jimmy's voice boomed over the cheers. She waved, took her seat in the guest chair, and the interview began exactly as planned. They laughed about her latest album. They joked about her cats. Jimmy pulled out one of his famous props, and Taylor played along perfectly, the professional she'd always been. Everything was going exactly according to script. The producers in the control room were pleased. The audience was engaged. The cameras captured every smile, every laugh, every perfectly timed beat. And then, 8 minutes and 43 seconds into the interview, everything changed. Taylor Swift stopped mid-sentence. Her smile vanished. Her head turned sharply toward the audience, and her hand shot up in a gesture that needed no words. "Wait. Stop. Listen." Jimmy Fallon's face went from confused to concerned in less than a second. The Roots stopped their subtle background groove. The audience, sensing something real was happening, fell into an eerie silence. In a studio designed for noise, for laughter, for applause, the quiet was deafening. "Did you hear that?" Taylor's voice was barely above a whisper, but in that silence, it carried to every corner of the room. Jimmy leaned forward, his host instincts kicking in. "Hear what?" "Taylor, what?" She raised her hand again, more urgently this time. And then it came again. A sound. Faint. Fragile. A child crying. Not the tantrum of a frustrated kid. Not the whining of someone who wanted attention. This was different. This was the sound of a child in genuine distress, the kind of cry that every parent, every human with a functioning heart, recognizes immediately as wrong. Taylor Swift stood up from her chair. The cameras didn't know whether to keep rolling or cut away. The producers in the booth were frantically whispering into headsets. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't planned. This was live television going completely off the rails. But Jimmy Fallon didn't panic. In that moment, something shifted in his expression. The talk show host who'd built a career on scripted bits and rehearsed segments disappeared, and what remained was simply a man who understood that something more important than entertainment was happening right in front of him. "Keep the cameras rolling," he said quietly to his crew, then stood up from behind his desk and walked around to stand beside Taylor. "Where is it coming from?" Taylor was already moving toward the audience, her heels clicking on the studio floor, her hand cupped to her ear. The audience members in the front rows were looking around, confused, some pointing toward the back of the studio near the entrance doors. And that's when the story behind the sound began to reveal itself. What nobody in that studio knew, what the cameras hadn't captured, was that in the back row, in seat 237, sat a 9-year-old girl named Emma Collins and her mother, Sarah. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. 3 months earlier, Emma had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder that was slowly stealing her childhood one day at a time. The treatments were grueling. The hospital stays were frequent. But through it all, Emma had held on to one dream, one bright spot that kept her going through the darkest nights, seeing Taylor Swift perform live. When her mother learned that Taylor would be appearing on The Tonight Show, she'd entered every ticket lottery, refreshed every website, called every contact she had. Against impossible odds, she'd secured 2 tickets. They'd flown from Denver to New York, Emma's medical equipment packed carefully in checked bags, medications organized in a carry-on that Sarah never let out of her sight. Emma had been doing well during the interview. She'd smiled. She'd clapped. She'd sung along quietly when the Roots played a brief snippet of one of Taylor's songs. But the excitement, the energy, the sheer emotional overwhelm of being in the same room as her hero had triggered something. Her blood sugar had crashed. Her body, already fragile from months of treatment, had begun to shut down. The crying that Taylor had heard wasn't Emma. It was Sarah, trying desperately and quietly to wake her daughter who had slumped forward in her seat, unresponsive. Taylor Swift reached the back row first, her dress trailing behind her, every instinct of performance abandoned in favor of something more primal, the need to help. Jimmy Fallon was right behind her, his microphone still clipped to his jacket, broadcasting every moment to millions of viewers and the studio audience that had gone completely silent. "Call 911, Taylor said firmly to the nearest producer, but her voice was calm, controlled. She knelt beside Emma's seat, her hand going to the child's wrist, checking for a pulse with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. "She's breathing. Jimmy, I need her medical bag." "Mom, where's her medical bag?" Sarah, tears streaming down her face, fumbling with shaking hands, produced a small red backpack. "She has. The insulin is in the front pocket she needs." "I've got it." Taylor was already unzipping the bag, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Jimmy, call my doctor. He's downstairs. Tell him to get up here now with his medical kit." But Jimmy Fallon wasn't moving. He was frozen, watching this woman who moments ago had been promoting an album, now cradling a child she'd never met, speaking with the authority of someone trained in emergency response. Later, he would learn that Taylor had made it a point to get certified in basic emergency care after a fan had once fainted at one of her concerts. She'd promised herself she would never be helpless if someone needed her. "Jimmy." Taylor's voice snapped him back. "The doctor. Now." He moved then, pulling out his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he made the call. The audience watched in stunned silence as paramedics arrived, as Taylor stayed with Emma, holding her hand, speaking softly to her even though the child was unconscious. Sarah collapsed into a seat, overwhelmed, and it was Jimmy who sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, saying nothing because sometimes there are no words. The cameras captured all of it. Every moment. Every tear. Every second of Taylor Swift being not a superstar, not a celebrity, but simply a human being doing what needed to be done. Behind the scenes, the producers faced a decision that would define what The Tonight Show stood for. They could cut to commercial. They could edit this out later. They could protect the carefully crafted image of late-night entertainment. Jimmy Fallon made the decision for them. He stood up, walked back to his desk, looked directly into camera one, and spoke with a rawness that millions of viewers had never heard from him before. "We're going to take a pause here. I know this isn't what anyone expected tonight. But life doesn't always follow a script, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is be present for each other. Emma is getting the help she needs. Her mom is being taken care of. And Taylor." He paused, his voice catching. "Taylor Swift is exactly who you'd hope she'd be when it matters most." He gestured to the audience. "We're going to stay right here. We're going to wait. And we're going to remember that behind every ticket, every seat in this studio, there's a story. There's a person. There's a life that matters more than any show." The audience began to applaud, but it wasn't the wild, excited applause of entertainment. It was something deeper. It was the sound of people recognizing something true, something real, something that reminded them why they'd wanted to be there in the first place. Taylor stayed with Emma until the paramedics had stabilized her, until her eyes fluttered open, until the first word out of the child's mouth was a whispered, "Taylor? I'm here, sweetheart," Taylor said, and the crack in her voice was the sound of someone who understood exactly how fragile life could be. "You're going to be okay." Emma was taken to the hospital as a precaution. Sarah went with her, but before she left, she turned back to the stage where Jimmy and Taylor stood together, and she said just 2 words. "Thank you." Those 2 words hung in the air long after the ambulance had left, long after the studio had emptied, long after the cameras had stopped rolling. But the story didn't end there. It couldn't. Because what happened in Studio 6B that night rippled out in ways that nobody could have predicted. Jimmy Fallon didn't continue the show that night. For the first time in the history of The Tonight Show, they aired the entire incident, unedited, uncut, with a simple message at the end. Sometimes the show must pause for something more important. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, #ThankYouTaylor and #JimmyFallon were trending worldwide. But more than that, something shifted in the collective consciousness of viewers who had watched it unfold. People began sharing their own stories in the comments, on social media, and letters to the show. Stories of illnesses faced, of children fighting battles no child should have to fight, of moments when a stranger's kindness had made all the difference. The video of that night wasn't just viral entertainment. It became a reminder of what human connection actually looked like. 3 days later, when Emma was released from the hospital, there was a package waiting for her at the hotel where she and her mother were staying. Inside was a handwritten note from Taylor Swift and a guitar, not an expensive one, not a collector's item, but a simple, playable instrument with Taylor's signature on the case and a message that read, "For all the songs you're going to write. Love, Taylor." But there was something else in that package. Something that Jimmy Fallon had added without telling anyone, not even Taylor. It was his notepad from that night, the one he'd been holding when Emma had collapsed, with a single sentence written in his handwriting. Emma Collins reminded us all what really matters. Never forget that. When Sarah called The Tonight Show to thank them, it was Jimmy who answered. He didn't let an assistant handle it. He didn't send a form response. He picked up the phone himself and talked to Sarah for 40 minutes about Emma's treatment, about her prognosis, about the foundation Taylor had connected them with that specialized in rare pediatric disorders. He asked about Emma's favorite subjects in school, her favorite foods, what made her laugh. "Can I tell you something?" Sarah said toward the end of the call, her voice thick with emotion. "Everyone always talks about how nice you are on TV, how funny you are. But what you did that night, staying with me, just sitting there when you didn't have to, that's who you really are, isn't it?" Jimmy was quiet for a moment. "I'm just someone who knows that the show isn't the most important thing in the room. The people are. Always." That phone call was never publicized. No PR team wrote about it. No social media post commemorated it. It was simply Jimmy Fallon being the person he'd always tried to be when the cameras weren't rolling, someone who cared. 6 months later, Emma Collins returned to The Tonight Show as a special guest. This time, she walked onto that stage herself, her treatment successful, her prognosis positive, her smile bright enough to light up the entire studio. Taylor Swift surprised everyone by showing up unannounced. She and Emma performed a duet, a song Emma had written on the guitar Taylor had given her, a song about survival, about hope, about the night when everything could have gone differently but didn't. Jimmy Fallon sat at his desk and cried openly as he watched them perform. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't apologize for it. He let the world see a man moved by the beauty of second chances, by the power of compassion, by the reminder that every single person walking through those studio doors carried a universe of experiences that mattered infinitely more than ratings or viral moments. When the performance ended, Emma walked over to Jimmy's desk and handed him something. It was a small pin, handmade, with the words, "Thank you for waiting," engraved on it. "This is for that night," Emma said simply. "For not making my mom feel like we were a problem. For making us feel like we mattered." Jimmy pinned it to his jacket. He wore it for every show that week. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Years later, when people ask Jimmy Fallon about his proudest moment on The Tonight Show, he doesn't mention the viral sketches or the A-list interviews. He talks about the night the show stopped. The night when a sound in the audience reminded everyone what truly matters. That pin still sits in a frame in his dressing room. Next to it, a photo, Emma, Sarah, Taylor, and Jimmy, all smiling. Below it, a handwritten note that reads, "The best shows are the ones we never planned. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop, listen, and care.